In this video, I'm going to dig in on 5 of my favorite running backs to draft in 2024 fantasy football leagues. I'm Nick Whalen from RotoWire. Let's get right to it. We start at the top. Bijan Robinson. Got to be back in on Bijan Robinson this year. Finished as the RB9 as a rookie in PPR leagues, despite, to put it lightly, some strange workload patterns, some strange things just going on with that Atlanta offense in general. Robinson ranked 28th in the NFL in rush attempts per game. He had fewer total touches than Najee Harris. He had fewer total touches than Chuba Hubbard last season. Still finished in the top 10 in the league in scrimmage yards, thanks in large part to 58 catches out of the backfield. Falcons not only got rid of Arthur Smith, they bring in Zack Robinson. He comes over from LA to take over as the OC. I expect Bijan's usage numbers to spike in year 2. Zack Robinson, that is, was at the helm of a Rams offense that saw Kyren Williams out-carry Bijan Robinson last season, despite playing 5 fewer games. Kyren led the NFL in rush attempts per game by a wide margin, 19 carries per game for Kyren Williams. The hope is that Zack Robinson implements a similar mandate with an even more talented and more dynamic workhorse in Bijan Robinson. Overall, we should just see a more competent and diverse offense under Zack Robinson. Last season, the Falcons were incredibly predictable. Did not run a whole lot of 11 personnel. In fact, they used 11 personnel at the second lowest rate in the NFL. That led to a ton of stack boxes for Bijan Robinson. Now you got Kirk Cousins in place. The Falcons finally have a competent quarterback. Really can't overstate how much of an upgrade a healthy Kirk Cousins is over Desmond Ridder, over Taylor Heineke, even if Cousins isn't playing at the rate that he was prior to the injury last year, which was on pace to be arguably the best statistical season of his career. He's still a massive upgrade over Ridder and Heineke, who defenses clearly did not respect for much of last season. The rub, of course, is that better QB play could mean a more competent passing game. That means more involvement for Drake London, more involvement for Kyle Pitts, who could be back from the dead. So with that in mind, it's very possible Bijan Robinson loses some targets in the passing game. The Falcons targeted running backs at nearly a 25% clip last season. That was one of the highest percentages in the NFL. This should not be a dump-off rate offense like it was for much of 2023. So we probably don't see that level of check down reliance under Kirk Cousins. But my view on this is that whatever level of targets Robinson could potentially lose in the passing game, he'll almost certainly make up for it with significantly higher volume on the ground. And realistically, they're still going to use Bijan Robinson a ton, catching the ball out of the backfield. So that's not that big of a concern for me. If I'm picking in the middle of round 1, I'm completely comfortable building my roster around a workhorse in Bijan Robinson. He's one of the very few players in the NFL who realistically we could be talking this time next year that he's the clear 1-1. Next on the list, David Montgomery from the Detroit Lions. And look, I know Montgomery by no means a sexy pick, and you could argue that his RB15 finish a year ago in per game PPR was more touchdown dependent than you'd like. But even if we're forecasting increased usage for Zamir Gibbs in year 2, which is completely fair, I don't think we see an overly dramatic change in Montgomery's role as the Lions workhorse, particularly in the red zone. Last season, Montgomery ranked top 5 in the NFL in carries inside the 5, inside the 10, inside the 20. Very quietly, averaged 4.6 yards per carry overall, by far the best mark of his career, playing behind an elite offensive line in Detroit. Montgomery handled more than 55% of the Lions carries in the red zone last season, scored 11 touchdowns on 31 attempts within the 10-yard line. The Lions did use Zamir Gibbs in those situations as well. He was not as efficient, converted just 5 touchdowns on 21 attempts inside the 10. I love Zamir Gibbs. I think he has a huge year 2. But this is one of only a handful of offenses in the NFL. It's a very short list that could be productive enough to support 2 fantasy viable running backs, 2 starting caliber fantasy running backs week in and week out. Montgomery found his way to double-digit PPR points in every healthy game last season. Detroit, of course, spent a ton of time in the red zone, 3rd most red zone attempts in the NFL, behind only the 49ers and the Dolphins a season ago. It's hard to imagine that changing this season. This is a team that's essentially running it back, a team that made the NFC title game a year ago. They have an elite receiver in Amon-Ra St. Brown. They have an elite tight end in Sam Laporta, but it's kind of a 2-man show in that overall receiving core, depending on what you think of Jameson Williams. Bottom line, this is a team that still runs its offense through the ground game, and I think they prefer it that way. And, Zamir Gibbs will almost certainly slice into Montgomery's overall workload. That's totally fair. I'm not arguing against that whatsoever. Even so, I still think Montgomery is ultra valuable in the red zone. They trust him more, and rightfully so, in short yardage situations. Is he going to blow past his ADP by 20 spots like he did a year ago? No, almost certainly not. I would say no chance. But if you're looking for a high floor option in the 6th or 7th round, I think he's that guy. James Conner, Zamir White, those guys could present more upside. I get that argument. But things could drop off pretty quickly at running back once you get beyond that 6th and 7th round zone. It's important to be realistic about what Montgomery's ceiling is this season, but for a guy who's going as RB20 right now in consensus ADP, I still think it's a reasonable value play in what should be one of the highest scoring offenses in football. You know I'm a basketball guy at heart. It's like drafting DeMar DeRozan, right? He's not going to win your league, but you know he's not going to lose it either. He gives you a really nice, comfortable, dependable starting floor. Not every player is going to be a breakout, but if you're looking for safety, you want that high floor, want that second or third running back, go with David Montgomery. If you're enjoying this video, please give us a like, subscribe to the RotoWire YouTube channel. That really helps us out immensely. We really appreciate it. Now on to the third running back on our list, Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders. White almost feels like a free space in this discussion. If you're talking about who could break out at running back this season, you almost have to mention Zamir White, and there's a reason for that. He's the clear #1 back in Las Vegas. Yeah, they brought in Alexander Madison. They somehow still have Amir Abdullah on this roster. I don't think either of those guys are really significant threats to Zamir White. Vegas had multiple chances to add a big-time running back in the draft. They waited until round 6 to grab Dylan Lobb out of New Hampshire. Probably not an impact guy for them in year 1. You look at the end of last season when Josh Jacobs was out for the final 4 games, Zamir White averaged more than 23 touches per game without Jacobs in the lineup. Right now, Zamir White typically comes off the board in the mid-80s, so we're talking 7th round, same general zone as Najee Harris, Tony Pollard, Raheem Mostert. Those are all guys who are in definitive timeshares in Pittsburgh, Tennessee, and Miami, respectively. White may not have the recognizable name value. He was a part-timer last season, but just holding down a clear starting job in an NFL offense, even the Las Vegas Raiders offense, is incredibly valuable for fantasy football. He might not be overly efficient. He might not set the world on fire, but the volume should absolutely be there for Zamir White. If you're shopping for that second or third running back, maybe you miss out on the Aaron Jones, James Conner, David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift tier, I see Zamir White as a really nice combination of floor and ceiling, again, due in large part to the lack of competition for that #1 job. Next on our list, somebody who I've had way too much exposure to in best ball leagues so far, Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. I mean, who among us is not fired up about the potential for this Carolina Panthers offense in 2024? The depth chart's a bit of a mess right now. You got Hubbard, you got Miles Sanders still hanging around, you got rookie Jonathan Brooks out of Oregon, but I see this as Hubbard's job to lose, at least to begin the season. Jonathan Brooks, of course, tore his ACL in November. He's on the NFI list right now. Likely won't see him until later in the season. He's going to need some time to get up to speed. I think Brooks is certainly a threat to Hubbard later in the year. That does concern me, but early on, I think Chuba Hubbard should have the clear edge over Miles Sanders, who was a massive bust as a free agent addition last offseason. Hubbard essentially grabbed that job away from Miles Sanders by week 6 and never looked back. Finished as the RB27 in PPR last season, now being drafted as RB43 in consensus ADP. You could get Hubbard in the 12th or 13th round in a lot of drafts. At that point, you're basically throwing darts anyway. There aren't many RBs on the board who have a path to a clear starting job like I think Chuba Hubbard does to begin the season. And even if Carolina isn't the most appealing offense, which it's not for a number of reasons, you got to give Carolina credit for making a point to at least address the offensive line in free agency. This is a team that, of course, did not have a first-round pick. They took Xavier Legette early in round 2, but paid big money in the open market for a pair of guards and Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt. They handed out almost $90 million in guaranteed money to those two. They went out and got Yosh Nijman, who played well in Green Bay last year, to help out at tackle. Obviously, the primary goal in that is to not have Bryce Young on the ground 62 times like he was last season, but there should be a much better offensive line overall, and that trickles down to the run game. Again, I get the workload concerns later in the season once Jonathan Brooks is healthy, but as far as guys who are widely available in the 150s go, I really like Chuba Hubbard's upside, especially early on. We finish out with somebody who's become kind of a pet player for me in recent drafts, Zack Moss, now of the Cincinnati Bengals. For the first time in several years, the Cincy backfield is somewhat of a question mark, with Joe Mixon moving on to Houston this summer. The Bengals brought in Zack Moss this offseason. They, of course, still have Chase Brown, who showed some encouraging flashes down the stretch last season, but I think Moss will have the early edge over Chase Brown. There's a reason they brought him in. He's the better pass protector of the two. Zach Taylor has already harped on that a few times in the early days of camp. Moss finished as the RB31 in PPR leagues last season. That was despite starting only 6 games and playing in only 14 games overall. His workload obviously tapered off significantly once Jonathan Taylor was back with the team and back up to speed, but Moss piled up 517 yards from scrimmage, 4 touchdowns in the first 4 games of the season. Before JT returned to the Colts, he was a top 5 PPR running back through the first 6 weeks of the season in fantasy leagues. In those 6 starts, we saw Zack Moss average nearly 17 PPR points per game. He might not have that level of ceiling in Cincinnati, but Moss is a guy you could typically land around pick 100 in a lot of drafts right now. He's going off the board as RB30 in consensus ADP, which you can find over at RotoWire.com. So you're basically buying in at what I see as his floor, assuming he's at the very least a part-time starter for the whole season. It feels like kind of the worst case scenario would be a 50-50 split between Moss and Chase Brown. If Joe Burrow stays healthy, this should be one of the most productive and high-scoring offenses in the NFL. Plenty of red zone opportunities for Zack Moss. Joe Mixon, by the way, actually led the NFL in goal-to-go carries last season. So I think Zack Moss could slide pretty easily right into that role. Again, I get the concern with Chase Brown. He's in the mix, but at that point in the draft, 8th, 9th round, you're not going to find many backs who don't have some sort of question mark or some sort of workload concern. So give me Zack Moss over guys like Jonathan Brooks, Javonte Williams, certainly Austin Eckler in Washington, and even Jalen Warren. All those guys tend to come off the board in the same general range.